Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Cultural Misorientation by Kobe Cambone, starting on page number 35.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Chapter 2 of Cultural Misorientation starts with a quote from Malcolm X. You've been hoodwinked. You've been bamboozled. The development or acquisition of cultural misorientation. Introduction. It is vital to this topic that we reiterate the meaning of the psychological and cultural oppression process. The psychological and cultural oppression process refers to the process or practice of imposition throughout American society, for example, of Eurocentric control. In other words, domination over information, knowledge, and understanding of the world, including the perpetuation of European cultural values, beliefs, norms, standards, customs, and practices through the operation of the educational and indoctrinating institutions and agencies of the society. So everything is used as a tool to indoctrinate you into a Eurocentric way of being. This means, of course, that American societal institutions impose the European survival thrust on African people as the only acceptable standard of reality for human functioning. Cultural oppression thus plays the critical role in the formation and maintenance of cultural misorientation among Africans in America. So their systems perpetuate this cultural misorientation that we suffer from. The phenomenology of developmental space encroachment and the formation of cultural misorientation. The psychosocial or psychological and cultural space encroachment and developmental pathways models initially articulated by Robert V. Williams in 1981 and subsequently modified and adapted in my own work in 1992 and 1998 to fit the worldview's cultural oppression paradigm and my models of Black personality and mental health provide the framework for conceptualizing the formative process associated with cultural misorientation. In the model of African self consciousness or ASC development, articulated elsewhere, I proposed that the development of a strong ASC depends on the nature of one's early socioculture environment or cultural developmental space. In other words, while African-centered developmental space naturally produces strong, viable ASC and Black child development, European-centered developmental space, due to the Eurocentric nature of the broader surrounding American culture, actually encroaches upon the psychosocial space characterizing Black child development in a significant way. Thus, Eurocentric developmental space leads at best to a weak ASC or a severely weak ASC outcome in Black children's cultural, psychological, personality, and development. So, as you can see, just being in this environment weakens our survival thrust. Under intense and chronic conditions of European space encroachment, cultural oppression, as noted previously in Chapter 1, weak ASC may decompose to such a severe state that the psychological worldview transition from ASC functioning, the African worldview, to cultural misorientation functioning, which is the European worldview, occurs in the dominant content defining the Black psyche. The transformation in worldview orientation dominating the African psyche brings about a major modification in conscious level Black personality, in other words, ASC, functioning, such that cultural misorientation content now dominates conscious level Black personality functioning. The following chart presents an outline of some of the key factors in this process. The two columns in the chart propose some of the key factors comprising the infrastructure of African centered developmental space as contrasted with European centered developmental space. Of course, due to the complex socio-political circumstance of cultural oppression experienced by Africans in America, the more typical psychosocial developmental space alternative experienced by Blacks approximates that of Europeans centered developmental space. In other words, most, if not all, African children in America experience throughout their early and later psychological development at home, in school, in religious institutions, through media, in their neighborhoods, and in organizations and elsewhere, some degree of European centered developmental space. In the chart, he says that African centered developmental space, which is the African centered socialization process, has the presence of African centered Black parents, first and foremost. So you cannot have a biracial couple that or a mixed couple that can bring about a strong African self-centered a strong African self-consciousness. An African-centered environment, African life cycle rituals such as ceremonies, celebrations, and commemorations, the presence of African cultural icons, and African-centered resolution rituals. The African self consciousness outcome is a moderate to strong African self consciousness. But in the European centered developmental space, there is a presence of a non African centered parents or culturally misoriented parents or non Black parents. So it can be a Black parent with a white consciousness, it can be a mixed race parent, or it can just be a flat out non Black parent. They have a European centered environment. The European life cycle rituals, such as their celebrations, ceremonies, and commemorations, are more important than ours. The presence of European cultural icons, they have anti African icons. The outcomes of this is a weak to severely weak African centered consciousness, and they are usually suffering from a minimal to moderate to severe cultural misorientation. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Yes, this is Dr. Cambone's work. We're reading Cultural Misorientation. We're on page 38. This includes such practices as European centered life cycle rituals and cultural icons, along with the preponderance of anti African icons through TV programs, pictures, and other cultural objects around the home, as well as books, magazines, and other reading materials, clothing, and physical self presentation that is endorsed by parents and other significant others in the family circle. And, of course, exposure to direct instruction and role modeling of culturally misoriented parents and teachers. While there may also be African centered icons and cultural rituals present within the child's formative environment as well, they are not usually in any way dominant or even characteristic consistently occurring in the overall socialization process. This same developmental process undergirding the acquisition of cultural misorientation is more graphically depicted in the next diagram taken from a an earlier work. So in this diagram, he shows the pathway to cultural misorientation, which is laden with different graphs and different pictures that show you that through the presence of anti African icons and cultural icons, or revering something that is Eurocentric, that your child winds up culturally misoriented. They wind up black skinned with a white consciousness. This diagram depicts the psychosocial formative process leading to the cultural misorientation condition. It shows that while normal, natural, and thus optimal African personality and mental health development and mentally healthy development proceeds via African centered developmental space, those psychosocial experiences and processes characterizing the top or upper row, Black personality disorder in the form of cultural misorientation results from the imposition of European centered developmental space on the Black child's phenomenal universe. Those psychosocial experiences and processes characterizing the lower bottom row. The lower portion of the diagram then is more relevant where cultural misorientation is concerned. For example, it can be observed in the first diagram in European centered developmental space and environment. The developing African personality is bombarded with Eurocentric and anti African values, beliefs, customs, and attitudes through Eurocentric miseducation and other cultural rituals and practices. You know, celebrating their holidays and revering their icons. This results in the implanting or indoctrination of a European, Eurocentric, and anti African consciousness within the African personality throughout the early, critically developmental years. The resultant Eurocentric consciousness in African children's personality and behavioral expressions is thus a manifestation of the basic Black personality disorder that we have designated as cultural misorientation. Eurocentric consciousness then comes to define the cognitive psychological space of the African personality under the cultural oppressive developmental process of Eurocentric socialization or modification of African children. Unfortunately, this is a process which characterizes much of the African personality development in American society. Some key aspects of the Eurocentric socialization modification process undergirding the formation of cultural misorientation. In previous works, I have tried to call attention to some of the more critical, intimate, and interpersonal forces from both within and outside of the Black community that most likely exert a dominant influence over the formation of cultural misorientation. Some of these are the parents, other family members, the home itself as a social and physical environment, the school, the general community surroundings, and experiences, among other aspects of the African child's developmental field. The Eurocentric socialization modification process. 1. Parents or childhood guardians, caretakers, and their worldview orientation, such as their values, beliefs, and customs, by direct instructions by parents or guardians in Eurocentric values, beliefs, norms, customs, and rituals. Discipline, rewarding and encouraging desired European centered attitudes and behaviors, punishing or discouraging undesired African centered attitudes and behaviors. Rule modeling, the European centered attitudes and behaviors by parents or guardians through self presentation aspects of behavior, such as clothing, grooming, hair preparation, makeup, jewelry, and medallions, and vicariously reinforcement experiences that are associated with such observances. So that's the primary way that children learn what's right and what's wrong. And they learn that a Eurocentric perspective is right because they're usually disciplined out of being African centered. Other family members, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and their worldview orientations, by non parental significant other family members in Eurocentric beliefs and values, their norms, customs, and rituals are the direct instructions that they give to children. In their discipline, they reward and encourage desired European centered attitudes and behaviors. And by punishing and discouraging undesired African centered attitudes and behaviors, they discipline children out of being African centered. Role modeling of European centered attitudes and behaviors by non parental significant other family members through self presentation aspects of behavior such as clothing, dressing, grooming, hair preparation, makeup, jewelry, and medallions, and vicarious reinforcement experiences that are associated with such observances. 3. The worldview orientation of the home's social and physical environments and cultural ambience. General pictures and other artwork. European centered artwork like photographs, paintings, ceramics, whatnots, figurines, and statues and sculptures. Religious icons like the classic picture of the Christ figure as a Caucasian and other celebratory icons that enjoy special high status or distinction that are Caucasian or European, or are European cultural centered and anti African or anti Black in nature. Television and radio programming exposure and other media, such as videos, CDs, magazines, newspapers, and books that are Eurocentric and anti African or anti Black. The worldview orientation of the school. Psychophysical environment. Eurocentric curriculum content, which presents European history and culture as the frame of reference for world history and culture, denies, fabricates, and distorts true African history and cultural contributions to the world, and presents the Eurocentric models or knowledge systems of reality in the liberal arts, natural sciences, and social sciences as universal standards for optimal human expression, and European culture as the universal referment, referment, referent for human culture. Direct instruction in European centered history and cultural beliefs, values, and rituals or practices, such as celebrations and commemorations, pledges, prayers, heroes and heroines, activity in social clubs, entertainment and sporting activities, and anti African curriculum content in general. Discipline throughout the school environment, which rewards and encourages desired European centered and anti African attitudes and behaviors, and punishes and discourages undesired African centered attitudes and behaviors. They experience role modeling by teachers, both Africans and non Africans, of desired European centered and anti African beliefs, customs, attitudes, and behaviors. They experience role modeling by peers and fellow students, both Africans and non Africans, of desired European centered and anti African beliefs, customs, attitudes, and behaviors in the typical and powerful associated forces of peer pressure, conformity, and compliance. European centered cultural ambience in terms of artwork and pictorials, etc., saturating the typical American school environment. And lastly, the worldview orientation of the general neighborhood, community surroundings, and experiences of regular occurrences. Peer groups and their attitudes, which advocate directly as well as indirectly or vicariously through role modeling European centered and anti African beliefs, values, customs, attitudes, and behaviors. And again, the typical and powerful associative forces of peer pressure, conformity, and compliance, and etc., such as church or religious environment and activities which advocate directly as well as indirectly or vicariously through role modeling European centered and anti African beliefs, values, customs, attitudes, and behaviors, and the powerful conformity compliance forces which they exert over Black children and adults. Recreational activities that are European centered dominate both formal and organized activities, as well as informal or casual play and recreational activities throughout the typical Black home environment, as well as the school, neighborhood, community, and broader society. So, as you can see, everything you do has a tinge of Eurocentric ideology and perspectives imposed upon you, whether it's models in a magazine or people in an ad or the videos that you watch on television or the shows that you watch on television, the artwork you choose to display in your home, the figurines that you those little white precious memories, angels or precious moments. I don't know what they were called, precious something, but there were these little bobble-headed angels that were in my grandmother's house, and they were all white, and it took them forever to come out with a black one that had curly hair. So even that iconography and those art pieces in the home are an imposition of Eurocentric identity on Black children. I don't have any of that in my house. The cultural oppression process and the cultural misorientation in perspective. The psychopathological condition of cultural misorientation then occurs as a result of the societal condition of European cultural oppression of the African community in America through the superimposition of the European worldview upon the Black community's natural African worldview orientation, particularly during the formative period. This is accomplished through the European centered institutionalized practices and their dominant role in indoctrinating virtually all participants in the society, and especially Africans who are socio politically engulfed in these institutions. Therefore, the Eurocentric institutions American comprising American society socialize, or more accurately, indoctrinates and literally brainwashes or misorients Black people so effectively that the cultural oppression process is almost totally disconnects Blacks from their African cultural reality as the conscious level of experience. During the typical developmental period of the African child in America, the Eurocentric reality and its institutionalized expressions literally saturates the African child's developmental experiences with European centered beliefs, values, ideology, and attitudes. And as Anthony McPhail says, through subliminal messaging. The mechanisms by which this is achieved is through consistent reinforcement of Eurocentric cultural reality, while at the same time imposing consistent punishment or deprioritization of virtually any affirmation of African cultural reality in Black children. The repetition of this experiential rearrangement, or Eurocentric modification of African experience through virtually every institutional arm of Eurocentric American culture effectively conditions the adoption and internalization of Eurocentric self consciousness in Blacks at an early developmental period. This process serves to subordinate and delegitimize expressions of the natural African self consciousness orientation in the Africans so exposed, and thereby forms the preconditions transitioning to the internalization of European Eurocentric consciousness, hence cultural misorientation. So all these subliminal messages, white is good, black is bad, even when you look at old dictionaries, it would talk about bad, negative, dark, when you would see black in the dictionary, and you would see good, light, white, and peaceful and different things like that in dictionaries when you would look up white. All of those messages enter into our children's self consciousness, and they wind up internalizing those things, which leads them to be culturally misoriented. This process of cultural oppression is not too unlike the desensitization experience of a person learning through psychological conditioning procedures, arranged stimulus response associations to suppress or render inactive previous avoidance, defensive, and maladaptive or negative responses to an adversive or undesirable stimulus or a self injurious stimulus at some level of experience, and replace them with the new and acquired and less defensive or more adaptive responses. So they train us to be white mentally through their subliminal messaging because they reward us for acting white, whether it's on the job or at work or in public. The chief difference between The chief difference being that the process underlying the acquisition of cultural misorientation can be explained most effectively in terms of cultural or societal institutional worldview level analysis, in terms of cultural oppression processes, as opposed to a more individual level analysis focused on personal deficits and the like. In the cultural oppression worldview analysis of cultural misorientation, what would ordinarily be regarded as maladaptive, unnatural, and or negative Eurocentric, culturally disempowering responses are reconstrued to represent those that affirm a mentally healthy orientation, while what are ordinarily regarded as adaptive, natural, positive, or African centered, culturally empowering responses are construed, in other words, intentionally misconstrued, to represent those that affirm a mentally disordered orientation. That is, Eurocentric attitudes and behaviors receive institutional reinforcements, while Afrocentric attitudes and behaviors receive institutional punishment. And such a reconstruction or intentional misconstruction of African reality under European American cultural oppression of the African psyche. Hence, a complete reversal of an African centered reality orientation takes place through this process. As I have observed elsewhere in my 2002 book, the results of the cultural oppression conditioning process underlying cultural misorientation can be illustrated in the situation of a Black person who initially adopts, as a tactical strategy, some surface European centered traits, attitudes, and behaviors in order to negotiate a strong Eurocentric environment, such as a predominantly white environment. Through the force of habit or repetitively reinforced experience, the person continues to express the Eurocentric traits at home, in other words, in one's personal life, and or elsewhere after the moving out of the strong Eurocentric environment into a predominantly Black environment. This is what cultural misorientation is like, in that the prior situational adaptation or identity becomes fixed or a more permanent aspect of the person's self-orientation, definition, or self-representation. Thus, the person continues to display the Eurocentric attitudes and behaviors at home and in their intimate and personal life and situations and encounters. In other words, they maintain the Eurocentric orientation when functioning in the Black community. In effect, then, the Eurocentric identity adaptation subsequently comes to be experienced as the person's basic orientation or identity. In other words, it becomes indistinguishable from one's distorted sense of their African identity. To the extent that the individual's personal and significant other environments, home life, and other significant Black social encounters respond to the Black person's Eurocentric identity as if it were really the person's authentic self representation. Then we can conclude that the culturally misoriented individual is receiving the institutional reinforcements needed, such as the social cues and signals from the social environment, to confirm the appropriateness or the reality basis of his or her acquired Eurocentric self consciousness and functioning. In other words, the Black person's psychological functioning and behavior are consistent with the expectations of the surrounding institutional infrastructure and are therefore reinforced by it. Thus, there are social signal feedbacks or confirmatory alarms systems built into the Eurocentric institutions, which provide those Africans coming under its influence, indoctrinated, victimized African members of the society, critical reality feedback. As Anthony McPhail states, we basically become Black Anglo Saxons, upon which they rely when such feedback is confirmatory in content. We subsequently interpret our functioning and behavior as reality based and thus as appropriate, adaptive, healthy, and normal. The social or societal cues and signals that Africans receive from European Americans in European American settings encourage and reinforce their culturally abnormal, in effect, culturally suicidal behavior. Remember, integration is death. In the case of cultural misorientation, this process involves Africans relying on Eurocentric societal or European worldview based institutions for reality feedback. We need to stop looking to them for our reality feedback. And when there is no signal of cultural abnormality, but to the contrast, the feedback confirms a pseudo cultural normalcy, then they have no substantive basis for redirecting or correcting, culturally reorienting their functioning otherwise. The Eurocentric attitudes and behaviors among Africans are then seen as normal and functionally healthy within the context of the European American social cultural reality. This then represents the key aspects of the psychosocial process which accounts for the development and maintenance of cultural misorientation and how the psychological circumstance of Africans in America suffering from the disorder of cultural misorientation differs from the acquisition processes involved in occurrence of other so-called mental health conditions. Thus, the cultural misoriented African does not receive any meaningful and consistent critical feedback. In other words, Afrocentric feedback about the cultural contradictions in their functioning. The reader should note that this occurs irrespective of whether the majority of the people within the social context or institutions, etc., are European or African, because the critical factor is that the European worldview defines the social cultural reality context in which the psychological functioning and behavior occur. In other words, it doesn't matter if a black person is treating you or a white person is treating you because the black people treating you already have been indoctrinated fully with the European worldview. So they're just acting like white people. This is because the fact that since the European worldview dominates the standard of normal and mentally healthy behavior for whites as well as Africans, then naturally predominantly black environments or blacks collectively can be just as much characterized by cultural misorientation as the individual African who is socialized and indoctrinated by European American institutions. Only in an African centered reality context, one which defies or effectively resists European cultural oppression through the assertion of Afrocentric values and norms, could such counter European cultural reality feedback be forthcoming for African people vis a vis the social alarm systems inherent and Afrocentric institutions. In the next chapter, we will focus more on the wide array of examples of the cultural misorientation phenomenon throughout the typical or commonplace experience of Africans in America. So, as you can see, cultural misorientation is happening for all of us, no matter where we are, no matter who we are. Each and every one of us have something in our lives that dictates that we have been culturally misoriented, whether it's the iconography or the pictures or the news media or the artwork or the magazines or the ads or the supermodels or the musicians. Everything has been tainted with the stain of Eurocentricness. Chapter 3 starts with a quote from Dr. Bobby E. Wright, and it says, "The only contradiction among Blacks in America is that for us, there are no contradictions." Chapter 3, some examples of cultural misorientation and its prevalence among Africans in America. Introduction. The cultural misorientation model allows for a new approach to our conceptualization and understanding of the psychological distortions and pathologies that are so prevalent in contemporary African values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. While I have employed this construct to specifically explain the mental health predicament of Africans in America, it actually applies to many aspects, in many respects, to Africans anywhere living under European, Arab, or Asian cultural domination throughout the world. This cultural specific mental disorder is rather pervasive in the functioning of African people of the world over. Whether one observes the more blatant and demonstrative anti Black or self destructive behaviors of Africans in urban environments like drugs, crime, and other various forms of physical violence directed against other Blacks, or whether one observes the more subtle, disguised, and socially acceptable approved forms, as in our preference for light skin over dark skin and our perception of beauty and attractiveness, or our obsession with the curling and straightening our hair to approximate the typical Caucasian good hair texture look, or our uncompromising total commitment to the racial integration in our so called human rights strategy and our personal individual social expressions as well. The cultural misorientation paradigm seems inescapable as the most effective explanation. A number of researchers have also noted that cultural misorientation is manifested in our uncompromising commitment to Eurocentric defined and controlled ideas, definitions of reality, knowledge, history, cultural values, rituals, and customs. This is why it's important to have to for people like Anthony McPhail to speak and speak often because has encyclopedic knowledge of current and past African events. That's why it's important for us to have our own holidays or holy days that we set aside. That's why it's important for us to practice our own rituals and for us to do our own thing that does not commingle with their thing. So, this consists of, for example, our acceptance of non contradictory of European names and other non African names, such as Arabic names, for ourselves, and our acceptance of non African self definition rituals, and customs, including our personal grooming and clothing, our acceptance of European centered child rearing, marriage, and family practices, as well as our acceptance of their educational, religious, economic, political governance, aesthetic, recreational, and entertainment practices, and even our adoption of their systems of deviance and pathology. The very insightful observations of psychopathology in African behavior that have been made by many in our early and contemporary social analysis, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Franz Fanon, E. Franklin Frazier, Nathan Hare, Francis Welsing, and Amos Wilson, among others, confirm the existence, prevalence, and greater danger of cultural misorientation throughout the African world. This work is buttressed as well as the astute and deeply penetrating observations of many of our great African novelists and writers. Give me one moment, please. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you this evening?
How you doing, Matron?
I'm so glad you decided to call in. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I just wanted to say, Matron, I didn't want to interrupt your reading. I was just getting on, coming on since I seen you put the link out. But I continue to listen at you while you read.
Thank you. Some identifiable institutional sources of cultural misorientation. Previous research has identified a number of major areas of institutional organized life activities of Africans, particularly in America, where cultural oppression operates to create and maintain the condition of cultural misorientation. These all represent regular, if not daily, areas of African collective life activity penetrated by the imposition of the European worldview. Chief among these are the four key areas of education, religion, media communications, and cultural icons and other symbols and imagery. So these are some identifiable institutional sources of cultural misorientation. Sources of cultural misorientation in African education in America. Africans in America depend on Europeans for their educational paradigm, including the European historiography of the world, as we generally accept the white supremacy, Eurocentrism, assumptions, beliefs, and values that is promulgated as the philosophical core of every educational discipline. This process plays a major role in the miseducation of Blacks, which results in the misorientation of anti African orientation among Africans in America. This cultivates cultural misorientation because the knowledge base and skills development imparted to Africans in America promote white supremacy, domination, and Eurocentrism. The fact that independent African centered institutions are few in existence, unpopular, and poorly supported further illustrates the cultural misorientation consequence of Eurocentric American education or miseducation on Blacks. Sources of cultural misorientation in African religion practices in America. Religion in America, be it Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or some other non African cultural form, teaches and indoctrinates Africans to believe that the Creator God is a Caucasian male and that his chief representatives are white or Caucasian males and females, even though they philosophically espouse and advocate a spiritual, universal form of the creator in rhetoric, and the content of the values, norms, customs, rituals, and language involved are culturally specific to their European or Eurasian cultural practices. Thus, anti African cultural values, icons, labels, languages, etc., predominate the religious beliefs, symbols, practices, and rituals of Africans in America, again, be they Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or whatever. Hence, Africans in America accept and practice white supremacy or Eurocentrism as the core of their culturally oppressed religious beliefs and activities. 3. Sources of cultural misorientation in African media in America. Electronic and paper media in America is based on Eurocentrism and white supremacy, and therefore projects Eurocentric anti-African reality and imagery throughout its products, be it so-called black or white controlled media. This condition influences Africans to depend on Eurocentric imagery for their self conception as well as other values and knowledge about reality. As a result of Africans accepting white supremacy or Eurocentric defined media, it leads them to overwhelmingly patronize European centered media and to perpetuate it in Black owned media as well. Victimization by Eurocentric media conditions Blacks among themselves to encourage and reinforce their own communities' internalization of anti African or Eurocentric reality and worldview through Black owned and Black produced media. That means that a lot of these Black talking heads are just Black folks, white folks in blackface, because they're going to tell you the same thing that white people tell you. Think about, what is that? Black Fox. Sources of the cultural misorientation in distorted African cultural icons, images, and symbolism in America. Africans in America are indoctrinated to accept and utilize Eurocentric or white supremacy or anti African hero images as their very own symbols. Things such as the American presidents of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln, as well as the mythical ones like Tarzan and Huckleberry Finn. Through the movies and most other societal mediums and of communication and influence, such as musical, entertainment, and sports personalities, advertisement campaigns for jewelry, clothing, and other apparel, etc., it utilizes high profile Black spokespersons, females and males, to promote Eurocentric images and symbols throughout the African community in America. So they use what they perceive to be the best of us to sell to the rest of us. Thus, Eurocentric symbols and imagery literally saturate Black home and church environments. Black school and business environments, as well as dominate the contents of Black recreation and entertainment experiences, and not to mention, of course, our thoughts and ideas. This type of Eurocentric cultural indoctrination influences Africans in America to take pride in promoting European centered anti African symbols and imagery throughout all aspects of African existence in America. Some manifestations of cultural misorientation in major areas of individual, community, and societal level activity of Africans in America. Some major and typical individual level expressions and social interpersonal manifestations of cultural misorientations are illustrated in the following examples. Cultural misorientation as expressed in a European Eurasian cultural labels for self reference among Africans in America. As noted earlier, the widespread maintenance of Eurocentric, Eurasian centric names, our European names or Arabic names, and personal labels by Africans in America is one of the fundamental manifestations of cultural misorientation based anti African self presentation behaviors. So, the first thing you need to do is rename yourself. Related to this is the pervasive linguistic condition of virtual illiteracy among Africans in America in any traditional African language. Africans in America continue religiously since the so called emancipation from physical enslavement to perpetuate the intergenerational practice of selecting European or Eurasian names for their newborn children. Coupled with this practice is the monolinguistic linguisticism or English speaking only among Africans in America. And we do become bilingual or multilingual, we ironically adopt other European and Eurasian second languages. Hence, Africans in America suffering from cultural misorientation do not experience any contradiction or conscious level psychological discomfort in their relation to this form of African disempowerment or anti African behavior. Some African groups even perceive themselves as progressive and revolutionary when they reject the European name inherited from one condition of enslavement, such as has been the case with the Black Muslims, and then paradoxically exchange it for an Arab name and learn the Arab language or the so-called or a so-called Hebrew name, as in the case of the Hebrew Israelites community under Yahweh ben Yahweh. Contrary to popular belief, the cultural misorientation paradigm argues that this kind of practice represents culturally misoriented behavior as its foundation. So as you can see, even though you choose a Arabic name or a Hebrew Israelite name or an Asian name, until you select an African centered name, you are still culturally misoriented. Cultural misorientation, as expressed in Eurocentric personal physical self presentation and self imagery among Africans in America. Closely related to the Eurocentric names and monolingual distortions or deficits is the deep seated cultural misorientation based self presentation behaviors and distortions that are so commonplace in routine or daily African functioning in America, such as self-presentation distortions. Such self-presentation distortions occur in Black grooming behaviors in terms of hair preparations and or modifications, cosmetics for lightening one's skin and eye coloration, clothing, jewelry, and other apparel, just to name a few. Let us briefly look at several of these commonly occurring examples of anti African self presentation behaviors that characterize the contemporary African experience in America. And remember, this has unfortunately also spread to the continent because they bleach themselves white over there too. Cultural misorientation in African hair preparation. The fundamental manifestation of cultural misorientation in the widespread ritual among Blacks of literally cooking our hair to achieve the straight and looping curly hair looks, such as perms and Jerry Curl looks, some African writers have referred to this pattern of victimized behavior as hair misorientation. Africans in America and elsewhere have so adapted to this distorted self presentation pattern of behavior that we have allowed it to become a pseudo natural or taken for granted approach to self presentation and imagery, especially for African women caught up in the complex web of European worldview oppression. As other astute observers have noted, straightened hair is a battle scar of a lost battle by African men being unable to set the standard of beauty for their own women and therefore for their own children and those to follow. It is a symbol of the destruction of the African man, of African people, having one's hair cooked or burned or permed as a rite of passage, a historically, physically painful one, that when the straightening comb was used exclusively for black girls, usually begins during mid to late childhood and by adolescence at the very latest. Many black men who are within and outside of the entertainment fields, such as many ministers, including a well known and highly popular religious and civil rights leader, especially in the relatively recent past, also perm their hair as a standard style of attractive hair presentation. So we have to change our names and we have to stop doing things to our hair to perm it, to change the texture, things that are not dreadlocks, afros, and natural styles. We have to stop doing that so that we can come out of this cultural misorientation paradigm. Cultural misorientation in African fashion, clothing, and jewelry. The wearing of large gold chains and medallions, particularly those displaying the Christian cross, body piercing with rings, adornments, and tattoos of every kind, worn conspicuously and inconspicuously by African youths and developmentally arrested African adults, expressing all kinds of anti African and negative culturally, politically unconscious statements, symbols, etc., all represent a manifestation of cultural misorientation in African self presentation behaviors. Another example of cultural misorientation behavior prevalent in many quarters of the African community in America occurs in terms of the wannabe gangbangers, drug peddlers, pimps, and street hustlers, and the practice of replacing perfectly good teeth with gold teeth or crowns as a distorted statement of machoism, toughness, or a kind of compensatory expression of status or success. The wearing of highly sexually explicit suggestive attire among black men, such as tight pants, shorts, or body shirts, women also wearing body shirts and tight pants and short shorts, sheer skirts and dresses, and adolescent boys and girls is but another illustration of this kind of cultural misorientation. As was observed in relation to the cultural misorientation influenced hair preparation behaviors, blacks have so intimately and intensely adopted these grossly distorted forms of self presentation that we have similarly come to experience them as the pseudo normal approach to self presentation and imagery among our people. One of the deeply ingrained images of a beautiful Black woman in the minds of the culturally misoriented African male is the quality of long, straight hair, often, but not necessarily, in conjunction with other physical characteristics. It is commonplace, a normal daily activity among culturally misoriented African parents and other family members and adults to berate Black children for their bad hair qualities. Thus, the hair texture issue among Africans under European supremacy and domination is a fundamental symptom of cultural misorientation that eats away at the very foundation of African peoples, children in particular, self esteem, self confidence, self acceptance, and self affirmation, and their ultimate sense of psychological empowerment or African self consciousness. It feeds the deeply pathological virus of self rejection, inferiority complexes, and both personal and collective anti Africanisms or self hatred. This self destructive virus is now beginning to sweep the African continent like wildfire. Cultural misorientation, as expressed in skin color and physical features, preferences, biases among Africans in America. Another fundamental and related manifestation of cultural misorientation consists of the widespread practices associated with mulatto hypothesis complex doctrine among Africans in America, which manifests itself in terms of skin color conflicts and prejudices and facial and physical features denigration practices and or rituals. It is commonplace for Black parents and generalized significant others for African children to denigrate and not only woolly coarse hair but also a broad nose and lips and dark skin color in relation to their children, while concurrently praising, in a variety of ways, varying degrees of those physical features which depart from those identified as unattractive. The greater the departure, the greater the praise and positive response it generates from those who have been so blessed in the eyes of the culturally misoriented Blacks to possess the such admired, desired Caucasian traits. Furthermore, it is generally a fact that light complected African women and men consistently enjoy higher status and recognition and special psychological and material privileges among Blacks, are given more positive favored treatment and reinforcement than their darker complected sisters and brothers enjoy. In contemporary times, this pathological anti African practice has become more subtle in many situations, but it persists nonetheless and continues to dominate many social relation practices among Blacks. As an illustration of this phenomenon, it has been shown that most darker complected Black men of high accomplishment, according to European American standards, and lighter skinned men as well, select as spouses, as a rule, Black women who are lighter complexioned than themselves or of a similar hue if they are of lighter skin color. This practice, no matter what its conscious rationale may be, literally defies statistical prediction of normal natural variability in mate selection among Black men. Among prominent Black men, persons such as Denzel Washington, Samuel Jackson, and Jesse Jackson seem to be quite exceptional and uncommon, a rare and possibly dying breed. Although it is important to acknowledge the obvious fact that mate selection patterns seemingly based on skin color biases could actually mean any number of things beyond cultural misorientation in a sociological context outside of the Eurocentric social cultural reality, such as personality, personality, idios, personality, mm-mm, personal idiosyncratic preference, resemblance to an admired relative or significant other. Within this context, however, one must consider it as a primary reflection of the internalized white supremacy vis a vis the mulatto complex at this stage of our recovery from the Maafa. As has been noted, we constantly denigrate even our own children's physical characteristics, consciously and unconsciously, based on the mulatto complex doctrine perpetuated by the European worldview and the European survival thrust. Cultural misorientation is also manifested in the prevalence of African cosmetics for skin lightening and eye coloration. The fact that Black oriented magazines and television, such as BET, advertise cosmetics that lighten one's skin and light colored contact lenses, such as blue and hazel eye colors, are very predominant throughout their publications and or programming is further indicative of the cultural misorientation symptomology on both parts of the programming when it is a Black source and on the part of a Black consumer communities. This kind of advertising is also very prominent in contemporary media throughout the continent of Africa as well. This is blatant, dangerous, and extremely destructive cultural misorientation, functioning, and behavior bordering on menticide. Cultural misorientation, as expressed in identification with adoption of European and Eurasian religions and religious expressions, practices among Africans in America. Related to the first example above, embracing European Eurasian names, another fundamental manifestation of this phenomenon occurs in the tendency of Africans to maintain a death like grip or pathological dependency on European centered anti African religions that were imposed upon us and our great 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 grandparents through terrorizing murder, rape, and naked and give me one moment, guys. I'll be right back.
Definitely a great reading by the matron, man, the revolutionary matron. She's reading from Cultural Misorientation by Dr. Kobe Cambone, man. You know, I've learned a lot of great uh, information from the reading, man. So the matron stepped out for a minute to go take care of a dog, but she'll be back in a second.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm right here.
Okay, matron.
I appreciate you. But as you can see, um, I was at Africans adhere to the religions of their enemies and conquerors so intensely that many of them will defend the alien beliefs even against their own racial cultural survival. Such victimized Africans will fight, kill, and even willingly die over these religions, and numerous historical and contemporary examples in America, in Africa, and throughout the diaspora have shown. Among Africans who practice the foreign or non African religions of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, for example, the Creator is seen as male, is assigned a foreign or non African name. In other words, names are not indigenous to any African language or ethnicity, and the language used in so called religious rituals to venerate the Creator are also foreign, non African, Yet Africans subscribed to these non African concepts and languages and practices as if they were indigenous to African culture. In the case of Islam, particularly the Black Muslim movement in America under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, and now Louis Farrakhan, Africans transformed themselves from Western European psychological enslavement to Eurasian psychological enslavement under Arabism by adopting an Arabic name, Arabic beliefs, rituals, and customs, and learning the Arabic language. Likewise, in the case of the Black Jews in America, here we have Africans transforming themselves from Western European psychological enslavement to another Eurasian psychological enslavement system under the so called Hebrew Israelites religious or Eurasian cultural banner by adopting so called Hebrew names, beliefs, rituals, customs, and learning the Hebrew language, as is the case of the community under the leadership of Yahweh ben Yahweh. Of course, we cannot overlook the Black Christian nationalists, particularly represented by the Shrine of the Black Madonna community, among others, who see themselves as having transformed traditional Eurocentric white supremacy Christianity into an African centered form by changing the Eurocentric racial icons to Black racial representations and adding some traditional African rituals and customs to the otherwise Christian or Eurocentric customs and rituals. In all of these cases, these alleged or so called revolutionary activity occurs under the banner, slogan, or guise of African liberation and self determination. In other words, moving from Black Christian to Black Muslim or Black Christian nationalism or Black Jew. These alien religious adaptations require Africans to deny their own authentic history and culture and assume, psychologically speaking, the false identities and realities in order to survive in these religions, as Zigbo has them under the term theological misorientation to address the victimized patterns of African throughout and behavior, while not disputing Azibo's labeling and its useful intent or specification. I prefer to see it as simply another case of cultural misorientation manifesting itself across the broad spectrum of African victimization under Eurocentric and Eurasian centric cultural oppression. So, no matter what you decide to call yourself, when you decide to join into some of these religions, you're still just placating to a European centered or an Arab centered or Eurasian centered perspective, and you're still serving white supremacy because it's not African centered. It has an African cover over it. Cultural misorientation, as expressed in an integrationist obsession among Africans in America. In this area of activity, cultural misorientation in the lower value prestige extend to all Black entities where a racially integrated alternative exists. In other words, cultural misorientation is manifested through the dominant, pervasive practice among Africans of seeking and requiring European acknowledgement, recognition, involvement, participation, approval, and legitimacy in all areas of African life, as by ascribing deity like status to those Blacks who have been successful in attaining it. Whatever the activity, when whites and other non Blacks are involved, it becomes the preferred activity over any all black alternative. These kinds of instances of African self negation are constant occurring occurrences throughout the Black experience in America and therefore require no additional elaboration here. So you'll leave the all black store to go to an integrated store. You'll leave the all black baseball league to go to an integrated league. Those types of things. Cultural misorientation in the consumer behavior mentality among Africans in America. In this area of activity, Africans manifest cultural misorientation through their characteristic consumer dependency orientation as opposed to a producer ownership orientation in their economic practices. This includes the dominant practice among Blacks of spending money outside the Black community. It is a common occurrence for Blacks to avoid patronizing Black owned stores and businesses and to opt to travel great distances, often through gauntlets of various instances of racial harassment and attacks, in order to make their purchases from European owned establishments. An example of this would be the fact that Blacks knowingly purchase overpriced white name brand products such as Tommy Hilfiger clothes, Gucci purses, and leather belts, among innumerable other conspicuous consumption clothing and other materials, as a means of upgrading their victimized sense of inferior status and low personal and social esteem. While we may sometimes opt to purchase goods produced by Blacks, especially hair and grooming products, as well as some clothing lines, these consumer activities are still motivated by Eurocentric forces of materialism, individualism, competition, and our victimized sense of natural inferiority or deficiency. Cultural misorientation, as expressed in substance abuse behavior among Africans in America. In this area, cultural misorientation is manifested in terms of the widespread popularity of marijuana and cocaine, especially as the preferential drugs for stress, tension release, coping, and partying among both lower socioeconomic and middle to upper class Africans, including college students and professionals. While there might possibly be other underlying dynamics involved in these behaviors beyond the strict cultural misorientation interpretation per se, cultural misorientation seems to represent the most appropriate and effective explanation for the following reasons. These are illegal substances within the society and therefore are uncontrolled substances, which places the subject at personal and potential health risk in addition to criminality. They are potentially harmful psychological and biological dependency effects that they carry for the subject, and such usage carried potential escalation effects to other more potent dependency substances like heroin. Therefore, widespread usage of these drugs places the African community at great risk and thus collectively self destructive, and thus are collectively self destructive for the race. Alcoholism and possibly even nicotine use, especially where they result in addiction, could also be included in the substance abuse category as possible expressions of cultural misorientation vis a vis self destructive behaviors against African survival. Because of its potential and likely relevance as a casual factor in all of these cases, it would appear that cultural misorientation must always be factored out on a case by case basis before it can be eliminated as an important or primary link in the causal chain. So, marijuana and cocaine are gateway drugs and they lead to destruction, and doing them leads us down a pathway toward destruction. All of these, each area and each aspect of cultural misorientation that he's touched on arises from us adopting Eurocentric behaviors, thinking that these are appropriate behaviors for Afrocentric African people, and they are not. Cultural misorientation, as in Eurocentric and anti African media entertainment preferences among Africans in America. In this area, cultural misorientation is manifested in Africans' dependency on European values, norms, imagery, and practices that are projected through the electronic and paper entertainment media, such as TV programs, especially music oriented programs like BET and MTV, and movies, along with the dominant Black oriented radio programming that has long held sway in the psychological oppression of the African community prior to the rise of BET and MTV programming. These powerful electronic and to a lesser extent paper media communication entertainment supplements to the traditional and ever powerful peer group influencers have now become a mainstay force of indoctrination and manipulation over the minds of African children, adolescents, and young adults particularly. Cultural misorientation thus leads Blacks to overwhelmingly preference and patronize these Eurocentric, anti African communications, entertainment, media, and to perpetuate it in Black owned and produced media as well. Cultural misorientation, as expressed in educational curricula and practice among Africans in America. Cultural misorientation expresses itself among Africans in America through their dependency on the European centered educational paradigm, including, as noted earlier, the European historiography of the world and the general acceptance of the white supremacy Eurocentrism ideas, assumptions, beliefs, and values, and knowledge base that are promulgated as the philosophical ideological core of virtually every educational discipline. Thus, the phenomena of Eurocentric, Eurasian centric miseducation among Blacks to a large extent forms the very foundation of cultural misorientation. This is the main reason why independent African centered schools and learning institutions are few in number, unpopular, and poorly supported, as well as why HBCUs are not in any way African centered and do not offer or encourage African and diasporan African studies, and why such programs and departments are virtually non existent at such schools. Thus, through their Eurocentric approach to their own education, Africans promote further internalization of and dependency on the European worldview, thereby weakening the African self-consciousness and increases vulnerability to cultural misorientation among Black students. Cultural misorientation in violence and crime among Africans in America. So as you can see that we have to get to the point where we are looking at each and everything that we do as an opportunity for them to be culturally, for us to be culturally misoriented. I'm going to read a couple of more points and then we'll be done for the night because I try hard not to keep you guys too long, but I figured it would be okay tonight. Cultural misorientation as expressed in violence and crimes among Africans in America. In this area, cultural misorientation is expressed in terms of widespread black on black violence and crime that characterize, but certainly is not limited to, most urban environments throughout America. The extremely high rates of violent crimes against blacks, especially in urban areas where blacks are highly concentrated, give clear evidence of the presence of the underlying psychodynamic forces of cultural misorientation. Given the blatant anti Black core element of the European worldview, then anger and hostility against other Blacks is a key aspect of the cultural misorientation disorder. Notwithstanding the fact that a physical proximal convenience, living, working, and socializing around other Blacks as an obvious part of the context for Black on Black crime and violence, it is expected from the cultural misorientation construct that since Africans are seen as bad, inferior, undesirable, unattractive, unworthy, and deserving of negative treatment within the European worldview value system, then it is appropriate and normal for those who have internalized this worldview to act against Blacks with violence, criminality, and the like. The Eurocentric social reality, society itself endorses and acts on this anti Black value, and therefore, Blacks having internalized this worldview similarly act on it themselves. But note, he did not dismiss the all crime is first intra community, first is within your community. And so, because you live around these people, these are the people you victimize. Cultural misorientation as expressed in the widespread usage of the N word among Africans in America. Closely related to the foregoing, the widespread and highly popular, commonplace, in fact, usage of the N word among Africans in America is another blatant manifestation of the cultural disorder throughout the Black community. This highly denigrating label is used by Africans from all socioeconomic strata within the Black community and in all quarters of the community. For example, it is used as frequently by Black religious, educational, civic, and political leadership as by Africans in general or the stereotyped urban so called street Blacks. It is also commonly used by Black males toward Black females and vice versa, as well as by Black parents and their children, along with the notorious and high profile hip hop community, which in reality merely reflects acting out publicly outside of the Black community what is commonplace anti-African labeling and or denigrating naming activity throughout the contemporary Black community. Virtually everybody, all Africans in America, either use or have used the N word when referring to each other in general, and they use it quite flexibly to either assault someone verbally, such as to harm, injure, or castigate them emotionally, or in a psychologically twisted manner to reference them from endearingly. Given the European worldview foundation of this grossly anti African reference and its historical contextual foundation, African internalization of the European worldview makes this anti self reference, self castigation, a necessary outcome and expression of cultural misorientation. So, using the N word as cultural misorientation. The indisputable, widespread nature of this manifestation of cultural misorientation throughout the African community in America also speaks to the extremely skewed nature of the distribution of cultural misorientation among contemporary Africans from the moderate toward the severe pole of the cultural misorientation continuum, which will be discussed in the following section. Cultural misorientation, as expressed in the observance of Eurocentric cultural rituals, celebrations among Africans in America. In this area, cultural misorientation is manifested through the widespread adherence to the practice of European cultural holidays, holy days, commemoration, and, and resolution rituals throughout the Black community. Blacks are as committed to celebrating Washington's birthday, Jefferson and Lincoln's birthday, all of whom were notorious anti Black white hero icons, Independence and Memorial Day, Halloween and Thanksgiving days, and New Year's Eve Day, as they are committed to such Orthodox Christian observances such as Christmas, Lent, Good Friday, and Easter. Among many others, as are most European Americans. We see these rituals and rites as being applicable to us, Blacks or Africans, and our distorted sense of psychological enhancement, or as descendants of the enslaved Africans, as they are to the whites as descendants of the slave masters. Blacks practically outdo the whites in participating in these Eurocentric cultural celebrations and anti African rituals due to our pathological internalization of the European worldview. Of course, there are numerous other Eurocentric and anti African national and local observances that Blacks practice as fervently as do whites, such as Columbus Day, Halloween, and countless other celebrations and observances of reminiscence of past Eurocentric glories steeped in overt racism. Cultural misorientation and faulty male female relationships among Africans in America. In this area, cultural misorientation is manifested in materialistic and anti Black, anti African behaviors that dominate Black male female relationships throughout America. As has been noted, it is common observation that Blacks utilize Caucasian skin color and facial features or some perceived approximation of such traits as the main criteria for heterosexual attraction and for selecting, dating, and marital partners. This is especially the case as we move up the socioeconomic ladder of success in America, and particularly among Black males who usually have greater socioeconomic independence and privileges than females. As was noted previously, there exists statistical support for the observation that Black men who are socioeconomically mobile tend to select spouses who are lighter skin complexion, who are of a lighter skin complexion than themselves, as a general rule, while Black women tend to use income and social status primarily along with physical characteristics like skin color, facial features, and hair texture, etc., as the primary criteria for selecting male marriage partners. exhibiting a strong Afrocentric orientation does not appear to represent a priority criteria in dating and marital partner selection among contemporary Black males and females. This means that when the chances are great for cultural misorientation to form, the psychodynamic underpinnings of African male female dating mate selection patterns and family life in America. In summary, then, we can see that evidence of the widespread occurrence of cultural misorientation throughout contemporary African communities is literally alarming. In the following select section, let us take a look at some of the ways in which we might conceptualize and the incidence and distribution of this phenomenon to get a clearer picture of the scope of the mental health circumstance confronting the contemporary African world community. Whew, that was a mouthful. So, as you can see, cultural misorientation takes on many forms. It's in our relationships, it's in our schools, it's in our religion, it's in the way that we talk to each other every day, it's in the way that we dress, it's in the way that we do our hair, it's in the money that we spend. Each and every aspect of our lives is impacted by this. All right, and this is the last section. Distribution of cultural misorientation among Africans in America. The foregoing examples, when taken as a whole, clearly represent only a fraction of the numerous manifestations of cultural misorientation that are rampant throughout the African communities of America and the diaspora. Actually, one could literally go through the entire list of Anglo Saxon behavioral patterns outlined in Nathan Hare's classical work, The Black Anglo Saxons, and discover countless illustrations of cultural misorientation symptoms, manifestations that are still commonly observed today. They are virtually everywhere throughout our community, both historically and contemporarily speaking. Thus, we are merely skimming the very tip of the iceberg where this alarmingly pervasive condition of personality disorder is concerned, and it is escalating daily throughout contemporary Pan Africa. Skim your way through the local and national newspapers and other media throughout America, and you will find readily recognizable and commonplace examples of cultural misorientation, and even more so in the local Black newspapers and other media. This consideration should therefore call to our attention the real danger of the spread of cultural misorientation as we continue consciously and unconsciously to allow and participate in the dismantling of what has survived of our African cultural infrastructure from the Ma'afa, of European enslavement and its aftermath of both overt and covert racial cultural oppression. In an attempt to encourage a greater appreciation of the enormous prevalence of cultural misorientation among Africans in America, I proposed in an earlier publication a hypothetical normal distribution of this phenomenon based on my interpretation of it at that time. Such a distribution is illustrated in the diagram that follows. As can be seen in the diagram, the vast majority, or 70 to 80% of the African population in America, was hypothesized to be afflicted by moderate level or range of this disorder, ranging from minimal to moderate, moderate, and moderate to severe cultural misorientation, while as many as 10%, if not more, were seen as probably being severely afflicted and at least some 10% were projected as being only minimally afflicted. What this distribution suggests then was that most Black people living in a society defined and dominated by the European culture reality worldview were most likely suffering from cultural misorientation somewhere within the range from moderate to moderate severe levels of cultural misorientation. Such a bleak outlook on the prevalence and distribution of cultural misorientation throughout the preventative measures intervention models must take under serious consideration when developing effective preventative intervention strategies and produces and procedures and setting appropriate goals and objectives from the Afrocentric perspective. My current observation and thinking about this condition has led me to propose a modification in the previous projection to incorporate an even more skewed distribution of characterizing contemporary incidences of cultural misorientation in America. This modified diagram is illustrated in figure 3.2 on the next page. Here we can observe a much bleaker picture reflecting a strong shift toward the moderate to severe end, moderate severe to severe end of cultural misorientation continuum, with the greatest shift being towards severe cultural misorientation levels, as contrasted with the greater massing in the middle area, moderate cultural misorientation of the distribution model of this figure. This means more or less that severe cultural misorientation has overtaken moderate cultural misorientation to a large extent in the characterization of contemporary Black mental health in America based on the cultural misorientation paradigm. Hence, the risk factors for cultural misorientation have probably soared upward over the past 2 decades with the advent of a generation of young Africans in America who have experienced virtually total racial integration throughout most aspects of their lives, particularly their entire formal public lives. So that's where they go to school, where they socialize, where they shop, what they do in their neighborhoods. There has been a boom of social integration, and social integration leads to higher levels of cultural misorientation. While being saturated with racial integration, which is tantamount to the imposition of Eurocentric cultural assimilation, this generation has had little to no African centered institutional experiences to buffer or to counter the unbridled European worldview onslaught upon the contemporary African psyche. As was indicated earlier, virtually all aspects of the lives of contemporary African youth and young adults are saturated with the Europeans' worldview and thus their indoctrination to the European survival thrust. Recognizing, identifying cultural misorientation among prominent historical and contemporary African personalities in America. As an exercise I have conducted with my students concerning this topic occurs in 2 stages. The first stage involves presenting them with a list of prominent national Black figures about whom most of us have substantial, albeit general, information, and having them to designate which level of cultural misorientation seems to best capture their behavior and functioning as we know it. Sometimes I utilize two separate lists, one made up of well known historical national figures, and the other is made up of contemporary national figures. Each designation must be justified based on criteria associated with the different cultural misorientation levels. Students can, of course, also decide that cultural misorientation disorder does not apply to some of the figures and provide some appropriate justification for that decision as well based on their failure to meet the cultural misorientation criteria. Prominent movie stars and entertainers of all kinds, athletes, religious, civic, and political leaders, educators, business persons, and social activists are all represented on the list. The second part of the exercise involves students developing their own lists and designated levels of cultural misorientation based on their own designees drawn from their personal experiences in contemporary life. Again, students must justify their selections based on the cultural misorientation criteria. The only limitation or requirement imposed on the construction of such lists is that the national figures identified must be generally well known enough with a public standpoint in order to respond to the task in an exercise in the hypothetical, so there is nothing binding or accusatory about it. The point of the exercise is to provide an opportunity for students of African mental health to engage in an African centered critical thinking and analysis about Black mental health based on the worldviews, paradigms. Greetings, Sister Ra. This has been one of the most fundamental deficits in extent African and extant African social psychological perceptions and its underlying faulty processes of critical thinking and analysis. Such deficits in our perceptions and critical analysis have resulted from the absence of truly African centered paradigms of personality and mental health as a guide as and help to guide us in this vital work. In conducting this exercise over the past few years, a wide range, a very wide range of prominent contemporary national personalities have been designated, from Michael Jackson and Janet Jackson of the famous Jackson family to Quincy Jones, Clarence Thomas, Kareem Abdul Jabbar, Orenthal James Simpson, Diana Ross, Ward Connerly, the California politician, Oprah Winfrey, Colin Powell, and Dennis Rodman, to such notables as Jesse Jackson, Vanessa Williams, the singer actress, Bill Cosby, Al Sharpton, Angela Davis, Louis Farrakhan, Ayanna Van Zant, Kwasi Mfume, to name just a few. Prominent personalities are only relevant to this activity because of the fact that some or much of their behaviors and functioning are in public and therefore more widely known. Plus, their behaviors often serve as very powerful role modeling influences over the Black community in general. Recall that cultural misorientation knows no socioeconomic or other boundaries or stratification limitations, supposedly separating our communities. Thus, Africans in America, ranging from custodians to bus drivers, from school teachers at all levels to lawyers and physicians, and from religious leaders to politicians, as well as social workers, and even psychologists and psychiatrists who are supposed to lead the intervention effort in this area, all can be characterized psychologically, behaviorally in terms of the cultural misorientation paradigm. As has been noted here, cultural misorientation is presented is presumed to be present at all levels and in all circles of African society, encompassing the full range of African individuals from the prominent to the everyday brothers and sisters. In this regard, the students' self constructed lists often include not only well known national personalities, but also more regional and locally prominent figures, as well as some family members and friends who have achieved some level of visibility beyond the student's intimate social circle. The recent book entitled Certified Uncle Tom's seems to capture, one moment on the last page, seems to capture some perhaps extreme cases of cultural misorientation, contemporary Africans, leadership, and prominent personalities in our community. However, this exercise is not designed to be either negative or overtly biased, one which designates only certain segments of our community as suffering from culturally based personality mental disorder according to the cultural misorientation paradigm. Notwithstanding the false nature of such an elitist and romanticized hypothesis, just the opposite is advanced here. The cultural misorientation paradigm, as can be seen, casts a very broad net well beyond the traditional Eurocentric mental health nosologies, which, as pointed out previously, fail to capture the true nature and prevalence of personality mental disorder occurring among Blacks living under Eurocentric, culturally oppressive conditions. Again, it is toward the development of the vital competency of African centered cultural thinking and analysis about African mental health that is being encouraged in African students of mental health throughout this activity. Our continued failure to develop this vital intellectual competency in our people, scholars, professionals, and laypersons alike, will ultimately destroy us if we do not intervene and correct it as soon as possible. Anything less would be indicative of our unwitting participation in the continuing and dangerous practice of applying Eurocentric analysis and interpretation to African mental health, further distorting and misrepresenting its true nature and incidence. Before we turn our attention to the urgent need for the development of strategies for intervention and prevention focused on the cultural misorientation disorder, the next chapter will summarize the work we have been doing toward developing strategies for measuring and assessing the cultural misorientation condition. That is the end of chapter 3 and the end of our reading for tonight. But as you can see, cultural misorientation takes on many forms and many shapes. And in his diagram, he challenges us to look at some of our historical figures, like take a look at Marcus Garvey, take a look at Baba Clark, take a look at Josephine Yakinen, take a look at some of these other people that we revere as historical giants. Take a look at Runoko Rashidi. Take a look at some of the Ivan Van Sertima. Take a look at some of the people that we say are our mental giants and find out whether or not you can find cultural misorientation in any of their headspaces. Find out whether or not you can see anything, whether they displayed inappropriate behaviors or not. Anthony McPhail, did you have anything you wanted to add or say tonight?
So yes, ma'am. That was a great reading, Matron. I'll say, man, I really enjoyed it. I've listened to some of Dr. Cambone's lectures, but I don't have the book. I've been meaning to get it. But where did you get it from? Where did you get yours from?
I got mine from ajani.com. It took me a long time to get this book because they said they had it on Amazon and they didn't, but I got mine
Yeah.
from ajonibooks.com.
The Johnny book, is that like a black book outlet or something?
Yeah, and they only sell Kobe Cambone books.
They all where are they where are they how can you get in contact with them? How can I get in contact with them?
Give me one moment. Let me get their information. Give me one moment.
Okay.
Because I ordered this and I ordered, um, give me one moment.
Okay. Take your time. Yeah, you touched on a lot of great things, man, in the reading too. One of the things that I like that you touched on, we know we always talk about the Eurocentric paradigm, but that Arab centric paradigm was very important too.
It is because we don't
Yeah.
look at it, we don't look at the pan Arabism that they practice.
Yes, ma'am. On the continent and among Africans here, in North America too. As
Right.
far as yes, ma'am.
No, I mean, you're right. I'm
Mm,
putting their website in the chat. Give me one moment. I don't have a
okay,
phone number.
it's okay. Yeah, I'll be fun. Johnny, how's that spelled?
AJ,
A AJANI.
yes, books,
Okay, all right.
BOOKS.com.
Yes, ma'am.
All
I
right.
checked. Okay,
All right. I
okay.
put it in the chat for you. I put it in the private chat for you. But yeah, so
I see it. I see it.
it took me a long time to find them, but because, like I said, other places kept telling me, I'm sorry about that. Other places kept telling me that they had the book, but they didn't have it. And
Yes,
so it
ma'am.
was really frustrating. It took me months to find them.
Yeah, yeah. But I'm gonna check it out though. Yeah, like I said, I really enjoyed the reading, man. I didn't really want to come on the say, but I just wanted to really kind of lend my support by letting you know that somebody was here listening.
I appreciate that. I value you and I value your knowledge base and your
Yes,
presence. I just value just all the input that you put in, the support that you give to everybody here at KWAZ Radio
yes,
and
ma'am.
all of your insight. So I thank you for that.
Yeah, I thank you for all of the great readings that you give. It's a joy to listen to you read, Matron. It's a joy. It's a joy
well,
to listen to you. You're a great reader.
well, thank you. Well,
Yes,
thank you.
ma'am.
All
Yeah, but
right.
look, I ain't gonna hold you up. I'm gonna go and knock off, Matron.
All right. I'm gonna knock off too. I'm getting ready to
Yeah,
get
you
out
have
of
a great
here.
night.
You have a great night too. I want to thank
All right.
Anthony McPhail for being here. I want to thank Sister Raw and the elders that listen with her. I know that Forecast is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine podcast is listening. I know that Oni is listening. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that Justin Liebert is listening. I know Wana Hagaziki is listening. I know that so many others are listening. I appreciate and value each and every one of you for giving me your time and lending me your ears to hear what these authors have to say and my opinions about them. And what I can say about the cultural misorientation paradigm is that we are all, by virtue of being inside of and under inside of this American context and under European oppression and white supremacy domination, we are all a little bit culturally misoriented. Now we all fall somewhere on that scale. The goal and objective is to fall as close to minimal to moderate cultural misorientation so that we can put our children on a path of being moderate to not being culturally misoriented so that they can being born today so that they can head down the path of having an African self-consciousness that is strong instead of the weak or moderate African self-consciousness that we have because by virtue of being here
By virtue, you're not gonna sit here and tell me that, oh, that's not me, that's not me. By virtue of being inside of this American context and by virtue of being near Europeans, you have an impacted African self-consciousness and you are a little bit culturally misoriented. I thank each and every one of you for listening today. And just remember that every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.